The console sits in the belly of an abandoned data center, like a jukebox in a burned-out precinct. Racks of dead servers standing tall as tombstones, LEDs long since blinked out, while the transmitter hums with the stubborn arrogance of a heartbeat that refuses a coroner's opinion. The room smells like dust, hot metal, and the last honest drag of a cigarette before the world went clean. Power cables patched with electrical tape and old faith. Outside, 1966 in the flesh, patched leather, safety pins, brass and kente, a revolution dressed like a fist with a rhythm section. Inside the skull of this station, 2036, reality is just another signal you can tune, jam, spoof, or sell.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
In Strand, we're reading 67 degrees Fahrenheit with partly cloudy. Airflow is southwest at about 9 miles per hour. The console breathes, a low hum from the war surplus transmitter, smelling of ozone and old dust. Hand-labeled vinyl records stack beside zines taped with kente cloth, a testament to signals salvaged and rebroadcast. Outside, the city is a cold mist, a 1966 ghost in a 2036 skull. Verified, a 43-year-old man, Looney Tune, received a 20-year sentence in Oregon for shooting at 3 police officers during a traffic stop in June 2025. This decisive action by the state exposes the stark power imbalance between an individual and the enforcement apparatus, where the system's chosen next move is often a severe punitive removal from society. Concrete facts. Looney Tune, 43, 20-year sentence, shooting at officers, June 2025, Oregon. Who is affected? The individual Looney Tune, removed from society, the community, left with the long-term costs of incarceration and unaddressed root causes.
The threads of this narrative connect to a deep cultural fear, the individual up against the badge, a collision where a name like Looney Tune becomes a public caricature, stripping dignity before the sentence is even passed. A viable alternative path could have explored robust community-led de-escalation protocols, seeking to address underlying desperation rather than solely reacting with state force. Who carries the cost of this confrontation? The community, left with a cycle of trauma and a citizen removed.
Imagine a system where the architecture prioritizes consent and intervention before lethal force. Instead of a 20-year carceral solution, a viable alternative involves deploying specialized mental health and conflict resolution teams alongside or even in place of armed officers for nonviolent traffic stops. This redirects resources towards building inner resilience and civic trust rather than simply reinforcing a punitive response. The next move is a reevaluation of first responder training and resource allocation, shifting away from a solely armed response.
Kaylin, on the ground, what does that look like? How do these specialized teams interact with existing structures or fundamentally alter them?
It's a complete re-architecture of the initial response. Instead of an armed presence escalating a situation, these teams, comprising social workers, psychologists, and trained mediators, would be the first responders to nonviolent incidents. They're equipped to address root causes, not just symptoms, shifting from punitive control to proactive care, building trust one interaction at a time. This fundamentally alters the state's relationship with its citizens, favoring consent over coercion.
Exactly. And this isn't just about softening enforcement. It's about restoring dignity to the interaction. When the state approaches an individual in crisis with support rather than a weapon, it changes the entire dynamic of consent and compliance rather than forcing it through power imbalance. It acknowledges the complexity of human behavior beyond simple criminality.
Patching in a caller, the pattern auditor. You're on the signal.
Thanks for taking the call. Are we keeping people at the center of all this change? What is the real cost of this cycle of escalation and punishment beyond the 20 years for Looney Tune?
Static lifts for half a breath. The vinyl crackles under the needle. The line is live. Same dossier, new angle. Keep the thread tight.
Concrete action. Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers introduced budget changes, specifically expanding the home guarantee scheme, enabling more first-time buyers to purchase with a 5% deposit. The official next move is to facilitate increased market access for up to 50,000 households annually. This policy exposes the government's reliance on demand-side solutions, potentially benefiting lenders and developers as much as the buyers themselves. Concrete facts. Home guarantee scheme expanded, 5% deposit, 50,000 households annually. Who is affected? First-time homebuyers, potentially existing property owners through increased demand, and the banking development sectors.
The cultural narrative of the great Australian dream of homeownership is potent, yet this policy risks further inflating property values, ironically making the dream more distant for those not immediate beneficiaries. A viable alternative would involve direct public investment in affordable housing supply, or even a progressive land value tax, rather than simply subsidizing demand and passing the speculative costs on to future generations. The housing market, in this scenario, carries the weight of this policy next.
This have-a-crack approach, while seemingly benevolent, bends the rules of market economics to favor existing power structures. A better system would shift from a speculative asset model to housing as a human right. Consider establishing a national public housing trust or shared equity schemes, like the UK's right to buy, but reversed, providing genuinely affordable, non-speculative pathways to dignified housing for all, not just a subset of first-time buyers. The next move is a systemic reevaluation of housing as a public utility, not merely a commodity.
Anansi, Kaelin's point about shifting from a speculative asset model is crucial. How does a land value tax, as you mentioned, specifically address the provenance of wealth in the housing market, and who truly benefits or loses?
A progressive land value tax targets the unearned increment in land value, which often accrues due to public infrastructure or community growth, not individual effort. It shifts the burden from productive activity to passive speculation, disincentivizing land banking and making housing more affordable by reducing the speculative component. The beneficiaries are communities funding public services and future generations who aren't priced out by artificial scarcity. The losers are those who profit purely from land speculation.
To be precise, the current policy, while offering a crack, primarily funnels public funds into a private market, effectively subsidizing existing property owners and developers by ensuring sustained demand. It reinforces the very architecture of property as a primary investment vehicle, rather than a fundamental shelter, without truly altering the underlying power dynamics of access and affordability.
So, is this just a new coat of paint on an old problem? Or will it actually break the cycle for everyday Australians? Will the crack just widen the gap for those who can't even afford a 5% deposit?
We have already run that tape. Here is the close-loop takeaway.
Downing Street faces an imminent reckoning. The release of historical communications between Peter Mandelson and several key ministers from the Labour era will expose the intricate web of influence and informal power dynamics that shaped governance decisions. The chosen next move is public disclosure, revealing the provenance of these decisions to public scrutiny, though the full impact remains to be seen. Concrete facts. Release of over 1,000 pages of Mandelson minister communications relating to his U.S. ambassador appointment. Who is affected? Public trust in government, the historical legacies of the involved politicians, and the perception of political transparency.
This situation lays bare the institutional architecture of political opacity, where the public's right to know is often delayed until it becomes a historical footnote. The cultural lineage here speaks to the long-standing tension between behind-closed-doors politics and democratic accountability. A viable alternative would be to implement a real-time transparency protocol for non-sensitive government communications, fostering immediate provenance and building trust, rather than waiting for excruciating historical leaks. The public's faith in its institutions carries this burden next.
The delayed release of these messages feels less like accountability and more like a controlled detonation. A more resilient civic architecture would integrate citizen oversight panels into the review process for historical documents, rather than leaving it solely to political discretion. This moves beyond mere revelations to actively building systems of consent and continuous scrutiny, ensuring that the structural integrity of governance is maintained, not just retrospectively examined. The next move is to democratize the gatekeeping of public information, embedding external oversight.
Kalen, these excruciating revelations are often framed as necessary for accountability, but as you mentioned, they feel like a controlled detonation. How do citizen oversight panels genuinely build consent and continuous scrutiny without becoming another layer of bureaucracy or political theatre?
The key is structural integration and genuine power. These aren't advisory boards. They are mandated bodies with powers of review, subpoena, and public reporting, comprised of diverse, randomly selected citizens, perhaps with rotating terms. Their existence fundamentally shifts the expectation of transparency from a when we decide to disclose model to a continuous public trust model. It's about decentralizing the gatekeeping of information and embedding vigilance within the civic architecture itself.
And it directly addresses the toxic residue of political obfuscation. When the public knows there's a real-time independent eye on communications, even non-sensitive ones, it transforms the culture of governance from one of secrecy to one of assumed openness. The excruciating part disappears because the architecture prevents the buildup of unexamined power dynamics.
What's the real cost of these excruciating revelations coming out years later? Does it actually lead to better governance, or just more fodder for scandal without real change?
Copy that, bringing it back to the main thread.
Teach through play.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Continue the signal at TogeeVision.com. Tune in, Sparks and Stories, Gig Passport.